Thanks everybody for attending this evening. I appreciate it. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Andrew Shapiro. I'm the Town of North Andover's Director of Community and Economic Development. With us this evening, we also have our Planning Director, Gene Enright, who's been working with me on this project. And just to do a super quick intro on this, we've had a couple community meetings, public meetings in the past on this issue, but we are obviously working on examining the idea of rezoning our downtown area. And that is something that we're doing that was prompted by our master planning process. First by our master plan, and then we branched off and did more of a deep dive into the downtown itself. We did a downtown improvements master plan that kind of looked holistically at the downtown area, addressed a lot of issues related to streetscape improvements, but it also kind of mentioned that we should take a look at sort of other opportunities like trail connections and pedestrian connections, as well as rezoning. So we're kind of making good on that, having these conversations, getting input from you all. So thank you again for coming out. And with that, we hired a consultant, Emily Innes of Innes Associates. So she's been working on this project with us for about a year now, maybe over that. And we're going to be wrapping up this initial portion of the process coming up in June. And we'll continue to do some public engagement on this into after town meeting, with the expectation that if there's an agreement that we can move something forward, that we'd be prepping it for town meeting of next year. So not this upcoming town meeting, but essentially a year from now. So with that, I will toss it over to Emily, and I look forward to a great conversation.
Well, thank you all for being here. I really appreciate seeing your faces, especially on such a beautiful night. So dedication on your end. I did think about putting this outside, to tell you the truth. So we, just to let you know, we're going to start off with a relatively short presentation in this room, and then Andrew and Gene, after the Zumba next door, I've lost my soundtrack, after they move, they'll be moving the boards in for the second part, when you all get to look at the in-depth information, and then we'll come back either there or here just for some Q&A after you've had a chance to review the data. So I want to kick off with talking a little bit about the process, and then we're going to talk about what we had recommended the last time we had a public meeting, which was in September. And I should check, you all can hear me, right? I can always project louder. Okay, wave your hands if my voice drops. Then we're going to talk about some of the updates. So what we did in September, what we're doing now, because it is different. I'll just give you a little glimpse of that. Then you're going to have a look at the boards, which are going to talk about the proposed uses and the proposed dimensions for the sub-districts that we're looking at. We do still have sub-districts. And then we'll come back after you've had a chance to review that and do Q&A. Obviously, as we go through, if you have questions, I'm happy to take them, but I know you will have more questions after you've had a chance to look at the boards, so wanted to give that opportunity as well. So we started off a little bit before May of last year. I did some initial analysis, and then we had a public meeting in May that was online. How many of you were on that? Zoom, yeah, exactly. And then another public meeting in September. I had a meeting with the planning board. I recognized some faces from the September meeting. Couldn't see all the faces on Zoom. And then obviously this is our third public meeting. From that, Andrew mentioned that we're going to continue to have public engagement. So for this process, we're going to do an online public questionnaire. I want to take the results of today's meeting and work that into the questionnaire. So look out for when that's available. And that will test the recommendations that you're going to see today. So you're essentially getting that advanced look. And your input may change some of those before it goes into the questionnaire. Then we'll have a planning board meeting in June where we present the initial draft of the zoning, just so that they can have a look at it, think about it, and then, as Andrew said, the target is not this year's ATM, but next year's ATM. So there'll be plenty of opportunity once that draft is out for additional comment and input. So this is maybe the middle of the process. It's certainly not the end of the process. So just so you all know that. So September recommendations. So what we'd done initially was I'd done a deep dive into the zoning itself, the existing zoning. We had the meeting in May to test some uses, test some different types of buildings, introduce people to the process. In September, we'd come back with a bunch of recommendations of some sub-districts for the overall downtown. And so you may remember, some of you who were here in September, the blue is the existing downtown overlay district with both sub-districts in it. The red was the boundary that we were looking at for the zoning. And we had divided it into potential sub-districts, as you can see there. Those big circles are gateways into the downtown area. The sub-districts, you can see, included quite a lot more land than was there now. So one of the things that we heard is that perhaps we'd overreached ourselves in terms of the amount of land that we were looking at changing the zoning for. And so this is where we get to, from September, Andrew and Jean and I have been working back and forth on, well, does this make sense? Does that make sense? What do we think? So again, this is the current downtown overlay. So you can see the red is the downtown overlay and the green is Subdistrict A, which is the historic mills. And this is what we're proposing to change. So it is a lot less of an area. And in fact, we're not changing the boundaries of the historic mill subdistrict at all. What we're doing, the only change to the center subdistrict, just to jump back and forth, there are two. One is this up here. We're taking a couple of parcels away from the center subdistrict and putting them into the Sutton Street subdistrict. And that's because that's one of the gateway areas into the downtown. So we want a different set of controls on it. And then the second piece is we're removing Water Street from the downtown, what we're calling now the center subdistrict, and it's going to have its own little subdistrict. And that's in response to actually goals of ours from the beginning, but also to what we heard in September about making sure that those historic mill houses are protected. Now, there are some commercial uses in them, so when you get to the boards, you're going to see how we're dealing with those commercial uses. But basically, really want to focus on keeping Water Street pretty much what it is. So the other part of this that you should know is right now, this whole area is an overlay district, which means there are a lot of different zones, zoning districts that are sitting under that overlay. What we're proposing to do is remove those existing zones and have it just be one zone. So when you see this, this is going to be a single new zone. This is going to be a single new zone. This will be a single new zone, and that will be a single new zone. So instead of having, depending on the sub-district, 5 or 6 different zoning districts underneath the overlay, we're going to take those districts away and make them single districts. So when you come in, if you own a property there, you will know exactly what it is you can do because it'll just be the one district. And I showed, and they should still be available online, the maps that showed how each of these districts are actually broken up into multiple sub-districts. I showed those in September. So what we're going to do now, or as soon as the boards get up.
Sure, should we, is it now time to like shift?
Yeah, well, the easels need to go up and the boards need to go up. So yeah, well, I will let you do that while I talk about what we're going to be doing. So what you're going to see once Andrew and Jean have set them up, you'll have a,
Sorry for the noise.
you'll have the 2 maps that I just showed here. Those are on boards, so you'll be able to zoom in and really look at them and see which parcels are which. And then the other thing that you're going to see is 2 sets of boards for each of the sub-districts. So one of the sets of boards will give the uses for the sub-district.
Oh, I'm sorry.
One of the boards will give the uses for the sub-district, so you can go through and see what is allowed now and what we're proposing to allow in the future. Now, some of them are as of right and some of them are special permit. We're not really getting into that much detail today, but you can give us your opinion on whether or not the sub-districts work in terms of uses. And then the other thing that you're going to see is the dimensional standards. Again, what is allowed today and what would be allowed in the future. In some cases, we are changing those dimensional standards, so height, setbacks, frontage, and in some cases, we're just leaving them alone, and all we're focusing on is on the uses. So you'll see each of those, And what we're going to ask you to do, and you'll see these same questions on the board, is to look at each of the boards and say, you know, are these the right boundaries for the sub-districts? Are they the right uses for each district? Are we missing anything that you'd like to see in the sub-district? Are there some uses in there that you don't think should belong in there? I was looking at them again today as I prepped them, and in some of the districts, indoor ice skating is allowed. And I realized that I had left it as a question mark on the board. So when you get to the boards, look for the indoor ice skating. Let me know if you think that should be allowed in that district or not. But most of them, we've made a decision one way or the other, and we're interested in, do you think that was the right decision? It is quite interesting when you look at the underlying sub-districts, by the way, what is and is not allowed now that people would be surprised to see in these areas. So, as I said, we're making recommendations and we'd love your opinion. And then finally, are these the right dimension, or two other things, are these the right dimensional standards, so height, setbacks, et cetera? And you'll see that they're in diagrammatic form, and then we took the liberty with a couple of buildings to say, okay, if you built them, just showing in sketch form what that might look like under the new zoning. And then finally, any other comments that you have, either on the process itself, is there information that you wish you had that you don't remember seeing at either of the meetings or seeing online? Are there other things you'd like us to think about as we start to prepare the draft zoning and get into the text? We tried to keep it very visual today. I don't know how many of you read zoning on a regular basis, but it can be pretty tough to get through, and I say that as somebody who reads a lot of zoning. So we tried to keep it visual, interested in your comments on that. So with that, I'm going to stop here while they finish set up and just see, do you have any questions on the process or on what we're going to show? Or on the boundaries? Yes?
Now, when you say, as an example, the indoor skating rink, who makes up these rules?
So, excellent question. Right now, we are collectively, in that you're responding to comments, but a lot of these tend to be, what you find in any community is that when zoning came into place, depending on the community, could have been in the 30s, could have been as late as the 50s, people were making various decisions about what should go where, and then they applied these districts throughout a town or a city. Didn't always think about the adjacencies of those districts. So I think the ice skating rink, for example, may be allowed in the I-S zone, so one of the industrial zone that's in this area. And it just carried on through. And quite frequently, I was talking with a colleague about another client earlier today, and the client had told my colleague, you know what, our zoning is a mess. We've been changing so many little things at any given point that the inconsistencies happened. And so when I start to look at zoning, that's exactly what I'm looking for, is was something like this changed over time and it's inconsistent with what's there now? One of the interesting things about dimensional standards is when you look at a typical New England neighborhood that was maybe built turn of the 19th century into the 20th century, even a little bit later, and then you look at the zoning, you find that you couldn't actually build the neighborhood that exists today because it was built before zoning, and when they put in the new zoning requirements, they put in something that was different from what's there now. So what you have happen is that somebody will come in and they'll tear down an older house and they'll build a newer house that doesn't quite fit the neighborhood. And it's because the new zoning doesn't match what's there and they're building to the new zoning. So that's actually one of the reasons we're looking at Water Street and taking it out of the current downtown overlay and giving it its own little sub-district, is precisely because we want to protect that existing historic housing, and that's a good way of doing it. So, and you'll see that the dimensional standards that are there now for Water Street are very different from what we're proposing in many respects. So, other questions? Yeah.
We're sort of a town, sort of a bifurcated town. We have downtown, which
Yes.
we're working with. And then we have everything else. And it's almost like we have two completely different views of how zoning works, right? Is this going to make that even more extreme when we get done with this? I mean,
It shouldn't, in that one of the things that we're trying to talk about, and Andrew and Jean, feel free to jump in at any time, but one of the things we're trying to talk about is kind of right-sizing the zoning for the specific area. So I can see, you know, I worked on the Route 125 corridor, what was it, last year before last year. And so we were looking at the zoning there and how it needed to be appropriate for that particular corridor while protecting the residential on either side. This is that same sort of process is what works in this area. So, you know, as you move through, just thinking about this idea of how should zoning respond to what's there now and what's desired for where we're looking. So, you know, what should happen on Route 125 isn't the same as what should happen downtown and vice versa. Yeah. Sir, you had a question.
Can you just clarify again in terms of the difference between all, like, what we have now, the overlays and so on, versus where we're going to end up?
Yes.
What you mentioned, I think it was the words like single district or single zoning district.
Yes.
So is it just, you know, one downtown zoning and then 5 sub-districts, or like each with its own, you know?
Yes. Let me jump back
rules,
to the
you know,
map.
and so on,
Yeah.
or, you know, again, what's it going to look like at the end?
So it will be one, basically, if you look at the structure of the written text, it's going to be one district with 1, 2, 3, 4 sub-districts, and each of those sub-districts will have there will be some commonalities to them, but each will have a different set of rules that make them very specific to those particular sub-districts. What exists now is you've got, for example, you've got industrial here. You have the historic mill sub-district, which is here. Actually, industrial comes down to here. You've got R4, R5, B2, GB, a little bit more of IS around there, sort of all in little pockets, just because that's the way the zoning had developed over time. And what that means is that neighbors of each other might actually have different base zoning districts as well as the overlay. So it makes it really confusing to understand what's going to happen where, because you have to know what your current zoning is, and then you have to know whether or not the overlay would make a difference if you're, say, a property owner thinking to redevelop. And in some cases, we found that even though a property was in the overlay, and this was particularly in the industrial areas, the overlay wasn't necessarily giving an advantage to the redevelopment of those areas. And what that means is they're not likely to change. And that could be a good thing. Again, you'll see when we get to Water Street, we're kind of hoping that it doesn't change based on what we're doing. That's the goal. But for other areas, you might want it to change because you might want different uses. So you have to structure the zoning so you can allow for the desired change and control the undesired change. And that's what we're trying to do.
So
Yeah.
if you implemented these sub-districts,
Yes.
would that mean that some zoning that's allowed now would be eliminated?
A couple of uses would be eliminated, yes. So, and you won't see those on there because we're not putting anything. When you go and have a look, the uses that you see are the ones that would be allowed. We're not showing the uses that would be prohibited, just because it makes it a lot easier to focus on the allowed uses. So that's why I'm saying is if you see something that's missing and say, well, I'd like this in this area, you should let us know.
But-
Does it impact anybody who's, I'm sorry, Stan.
No, go
Does it
ahead.
impact anybody who's there now?
Excellent question. So it would be, if you remove a use, say for example, you move planning offices out as a use, but I was already there, I would now be what's called a non-conforming use. And so I would have to go through a sort of higher standard if I wanted to expand my footprint. I might have to come in to get a variance for that. Now, there are ways around that. So, for example, we can put into the structure of the zoning, and you'll see it quite frequently in zoning, that if you're a non-conforming lot or a non-conforming use that was in existence at the time that the new zoning was passed, you know, there's a special procedure so that you're not unduly impacted by that change.
And you're not kicked out?
Oh, no, you can't be. So, that's a really good point. So if you're in existence now, a change to the zoning does not kick you out. What it does is it just means that if you trigger a threshold, say the threshold was you want to expand your footprint by 2,000 square feet, just to make that up. If you then go in to expand your footprint by, say, 2,500 square feet, you've triggered a threshold, you have to go through a new review process, but it doesn't do anything to you just staying as you are. So I can stay in my planning office as long as I like, but once I want to expand it, then I'm going to have to go through an upper.
Creating space, you might be knocking out a wall into the office next door to you. Is that-
But that's a building permit, that's not going to, I'm talking about additions, yes.
You can't create the land that isn't there. Most of the space is occupied.
Maybe she wants to put a floor on or something.
Oh, that.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's not
Right.
a footprint, that's an elevation.
Or maybe a tragic fire happened and my planning office burnt down. I really hope that doesn't happen. And suddenly I am now without a building, I have to build a new building, right? Then that might trigger one of the thresholds. But what we look for is, are we creating, so when you do zoning, it's very easy to sit there and say, oh, this should be there, this should be there, this should be there, blah, 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 I've done the text, that's great. The tricky part is finding, have I just created some sort of implication, some unforeseen consequence? And so it's going back through and saying, oh, I've just made planning offices a non-conforming use. What would that mean? How do I fix that so I'm not unduly burdening somebody? So that's kind of the second layer of review. The first is what do people want? And the second is the unintended consequences and how do we mitigate against those?
Out of curiosity, what uses are being eliminated?
Some of the auto-oriented uses that are currently allowed in the downtown districts, in those base districts, because they're not conducive. Having auto-oriented uses in a community are important, right? We all need to get our cars fixed and serviced and tires changed and all of that. Having them in a downtown, it doesn't really help with the walkability of that downtown, so those are being eliminated. So again, it doesn't do anything to anybody who's there now, but if they were to sell their property and somebody new come in, or if they wanted to expand, they might have to go through another review procedure. It's triggering that threshold is the issue.
Is that the only use?
Trying to think. Well, the Water Street District, I think there might be some commercial uses that are now eliminated. And then there's a couple of other smaller uses that aren't there and didn't make sense to be there, and we took those out. So, yeah. And I've got those tables, so if somebody has that question, I can pull that information back out. All right, I think we've got everything up except one board, which we'll fix. You all ready to go? And so review the boards. We have the typical planner tool are dots, which we don't have today, and stickies with pens. So we have lots of stickies with pens, so you can write down all of your comments, good, bad, questions, anything that comes to mind as you look at it. And we'll give you all maybe 30 minutes, see how you're doing. So, and I'll wander around, so if you have questions, feel free to ask me.
Decide, you know what, I'm going to retire. Stops business for at least 2 years, and then sells it
The new development.
This is Avalon, okay.
Yeah,
all right,
that's
all right,
Avalon
gotcha.
here.
Yep,
Right.
gotcha.
This is like West Mill and East Mill here.